But then it's like, Taylor's taller than me, so it's gotta... Oh, sorry. Don't pay attention to me. What's up?
After the last couple of days, and the first time I saw you, I was going to congratulate you. I was just amazed that you spend your whole life here. You're always here. Then I realized it's your car that spends its whole life.
I gotta do some things with my car. I gotta get rid of it, mostly. So it's sitting there until my parents can come and tell me what to do with it. I'm putting in a lot of hours in it.
Well, and your car is...
It's Sunday morning, and we're having Harvest Fest in here. The mic's not on, so I'll just talk loud. We're having Harvest Fest in here after church, and I said fairies, but then John said, do we believe in fairies? So I said angels will be in here between now, like after we're done, and service, and this will all be harvesty by the time we get done. There's some snacks, some coffee, stuff like that. Crafts. Stuff for you to do. Adult crafts too, I hear. Oh, that's on now. I think, but I've been less involved, which has been good. It's always good to attend an event. I think the mic is working. So this is our last week with Dr. Taylor Worley. It has been great to listen to him speak and teach us some things. He is, just a reminder, out at Wheaton. And we do have I have on the calendar a field trip next spring out to Wheaton for some lectures, not that he's giving, but maybe we'll run into him or something out there. So those are C.S. Lewis lectures too, so put that in your brain for next spring. That's coming. In November, the next time we will have adult ed after today is November 16th. No, November 13th is a Sunday. That's the day. And Reverend Diane Shields will be here to teach us how the Bible transforms our lives. She's always helpful when she's here. She came last January, and she'll be back. So enjoy Taylor's last lecture. Thank you.
Well, you guys have been such good sports. I want to just say thank you again to Maddie and the staff for having me, but thank you especially to you guys for your, willingness to go on this journey with me. So I feel like I've saved the best for last, but we'll see. All right, I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. But just to remind us, we're looking at the place of wonder and the arts in our lives, and how they might actually help us to become more humble, compassionate, patient, kind people. So we're doing that through the vehicle of revisiting Paul's experience in Europe. Paul the Apostle and his experience in Europe. I'm doing this with help from Doug Campbell, a New Testament scholar, who is just so taken with the question, why is it if Paul, who's himself such a Hebrew of Hebrews, as he tells us in his letter to the Philippians, why is he spending so much time with dirty, stinky Gentiles in Europe? How is it that this, emergent movement of Christianity finds itself in centers of cultural power like Athens and Corinth and Rome and places like that within the lifetime of its earliest disciples? Such a fascinating question. So today we're going to look at our third theological virtue and our third stop. There's lots of places that Paul stops in his missionary journeys throughout Europe, but not all of them are as juicy or interesting as the rest, okay? So we'll take as our third theological virtue today, we've talked about faith, we've talked about hope, and today we'll talk about love, the theological virtue of love. And what better setting to do that than in the city of Corinth? So we're going to look at Paul's experience in Corinth. And again, we're going to break some rules when it comes to New Testament scholarship. We're going to read the book of Acts alongside the book of 1st and 2nd Corinthians together. Apparently you're not allowed to do that, but we're going to color outside the lines today and try and think about what does Luke record for us in Acts, and what does Paul self-report about his experience of Corinth in his letters to the Corinthians. Now, just to kind of remind us a little bit more about who this person, Paul the Apostle, is and his particular affinity for cities. I just want to note a few details. So Paul, in Acts 21, talks about himself as a citizen of no mean city. So he grew up in Tarsus, he grew up in a city, thinks of himself as a city boy. His chosen vocation of tent making was the kind of thing you had to do in a city. If you wanted to sell your tents, if you wanted to sell those shelters, you had to do that in the city, okay? When he talks about all the places that he's been, he summarizes his journeys in this way. He says that he's been to the city, the wilderness, and the sea. So that tips us off to the fact that Paul is not really interested in the country. He's not a country mouse. He's a city mouse, okay? He has an affinity for the city, and so when he thinks about the important places that he's stopped and in the wild and wonderful world that God has sent him into, he thinks primarily of cities. Cities were centers of power, and Paul knew that. He encountered Jesus on his way to a city, Damascus, right? So cities play an important role in Paul's life. So we just want to remind ourselves, how did Paul get to Europe? He was sent to these cities by a dream. The Macedonian man comes to Paul in a dream and says, hey, come over to Europe. We need you over here. That was not in Paul's playbook. That's not something he intended to do based on what we know about his life. But he said yes to the call and finds himself in Philippi, finds himself in Athens, and now finds himself in Corinth. So we want to think about, what was Corinth like in the time of Paul's visit? What was happening in Corinth? Now, just through our general education, liberal arts and all the rest, we probably know something significant about Athens. Philippi is a strange and interesting place we talked about last week, but Corinth is a particularly complex setting, okay? Corinth is a city experiencing a lot of transition in the time that Paul visits it. So it was an important site that existed on this little isthmus of land where sailors could choose, do you want to sail around the whole of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, or do you want to just dock in Corinth and carry your goods 30 miles across land to another ship on the other side? So Corinth became this like port city of particular importance. And that meant that it was kind of a boom town. And it was experiencing, around the time of Paul's visit, this influx of commerce and this booming economy. Things were going well in Corinth. But with such massive changes come particular challenges, right? So Corinth, as this like economic center where sailors are coming in and out all the time and transitioning their goods across land, we can probably use our imaginations to think about what life was like on the ground in a port city like that, where sailors are coming in and out all the time. Okay, you may be aware, but in the ancient world, the word, the name Corinth was a verb. To Corinthianize was to have a good time, let's say, like sailors on leave. Okay, so the name of Corinth had a reputation in the Mediterranean world. It was kind of like the Las Vegas of the ancient Mediterranean, right? What happens in Corinth stays in Corinth. I don't know if you've seen that tagline from the Las Vegas Tourism Bureau, right? What happens in Corinth stays in Corinth, right? Corinth had a reputation not only for this influx of new money and commerce, but it was a vibrant cosmopolitan city, and it probably had a little bit of a chip on its shoulder when it looked at places like Athens and Sparta. They were really known for things, right? Athens known as a city of learning, the home of all these philosophers, right? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, right? Corinth was coming up in the world, and Corinth wanted to boost its own reputation, right? So they have They built this impressive Acropolis, and it was the most impressive at the time, the most impressive Acropolis in Greece. The flavor of all this social transition certainly comes out in Paul's letters when he's writing to the Corinthians years later. And what does he describe? What do we hear Paul talking about when he addresses the church at Corinth? Well, it's things like rampant social division, class stratification, discrimination between different groups, a very divided and divisive church that at the same time had kind of an inferiority complex. You know, the culture in general had an inferiority complex about other prestigious cities. And so it had some really high standards. It was expecting a lot. It had kind of an obsession with celebrity. They wanted Paul to be more of a public intellectual, more of an articulate orator like you would see on the streets of Athens. That's what the folks in Corinth wanted. Alongside that, they had a lot of issues when it came to human sexuality and the body, right? Paul talks to them about sexuality and the body quite a bit, right? This is where Paul announces that the body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, right? This is the group that he has to teach that to. So there's a lot of problems in Corinth in the time of Paul's visit, right? And those come out. So Luke tells us in Acts 18, right? Paul has just come from Athens and finds himself in Corinth. And this is what Luke records for us. He says, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Macedonia. Paul has so many fond memories of Macedonia, right? All the wild stuff that happened in Philippi. And then later he's in Thessalonica. Oh man, just to read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Paul loves those folks. He had such a great time there. He loves that church so much. He talks of himself as being like a nursemaid to those. I mean, he's such an affinity, such a soft spot in his heart for the Thessalonians. Oh, his companions are coming from Macedonia. So many good memories about Macedonia. Paul in Corinth was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that Christ was Jesus. And when they had opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Okay. In this short little report, Luke tips us off to the fact that Paul's tried and true practice of going first to the synagogue to declare the gospel to his own countrymen, Jews living in Corinth, didn't go so well here in Corinth, right? He is opposed and reviled. They're like, we're not listening to this. Get the heck out of here. We don't want anything you're selling. Move along, Paul. Paul, has had a tough time in Europe so far. He's like, what am I doing here? Why, is this really God's plan? So he's expressing a little bit of anger here, right? So Paul doesn't have a good experience initially. He's looking for a favorable hearing among his countrymen, doesn't get it, so now he has to turn to the Gentiles. And everything I've just told you about Corinth as the ancient, New York, Los Angeles, Las Vegas of the Mediterranean world, this is probably not a place that Paul wants to be. He's stuck in this city, right? And he's stuck in this city with the dirty, stinky Gentiles who think they're so smart, are so upset, there's such an influx of new money, right? There's like a whole nouveau riche kind of population, right? People newly flooded with money, they're always on their best behavior, right? Paul's like, these arrogant, celebrity-obsessed, sexually immoral, these are the people I'm stuck with, right? Paul finds himself stuck in Corinth, and what does the Lord do in response? Knowing Paul doesn't want to be there. Well, Luke tells us, Acts 18, a little bit later, Luke tells us, and the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, Do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you. For I have many in this city who are my people. And he stayed a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So much right here in this short, simple report, right? How did Paul get to Europe? A dream. How does Paul stay in Corinth? Again, God comes to him in a dream. And this time, speaks directly to Paul's situation, directly to someone who feels very out of place, feels very on their heels, dealing with all the mess, all the confusion, all the chaos, the social chaos. He's thinking, how am I going to start a church in the midst of all of this mess, right? And in that moment, in that place that Paul finds himself, the Lord speaks to him again in a dream and says, don't be afraid. You can stay. I'm with you. And shockingly, I think the most shocking thing about this message that Paul receives in a dream is the Lord says, I have many in this city who are my people. What does that mean? What is the Lord telling Paul? The appearance of things might not be great, right? Might be very challenging. But the Lord informs him, I've got people in the city that you haven't even met yet. People that you don't even know. Hang out, stay put, and let's see what happens, okay? Hang out, stay put, and let's see what happens. That's what the Lord is telling him, right? Now, I've set the stage here. We know that Paul's not wanting to do that, but he's obedient to the vision, and he stays a year and a half. Of all the places he could get stuck, I think of the Bob Dylan song title, "Stuck Inside of Corinth" with the Macedonian blues again, right? He'd love to get back to Macedonia. Those people knew how to take care of him. They appreciated him. But the Lord has told him to stay, and he stays. And what does he do when he stays? Well, Luke tells us what he does when he stays. Luke set the stage a little bit earlier in the passage. He says, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So he finds some other nomads, some other sojourners, like himself. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked. For they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade the Jews and Greeks. Okay? Luke tells us that Paul stayed, and he stayed busy. He found a couple friends, Aquila and Priscilla, who not only shared his ethnic heritage and his Christian faith, but also his chosen vocation of tent making. And he hangs out with them, and he sets up shop in the agora, in the marketplace, probably a stall like this. Paul would have worked with Aquila and Priscilla out of. So during the day, throughout the week, he's making tents with Aquila and Priscilla. On the weekends, he's talking to whoever will listen. Maybe if that's Jews in the synagogue, until they finally kick him out. And then the Gentiles. He turns to the Gentiles. So I want to think about together Paul's choice here, and how his choice to return or adopt bivocational ministry, is what it's like our contemporary term for it, is a reflection of what God's doing in him, but also a kind of ministry necessity. For the sake of the mission, Paul has to stay. And how does he stay? That's the big question. How does he conduct himself while he stays? He does something that he hasn't done yet in Europe. He gets a job, and he works that job. Now, we have in the letter of 1 Corinthians a little bit of self-report, a little bit of confession from Paul. Now, he's writing to the Corinthians to get their attention, to remind him of everything that he taught them, to get them to act right, get their act together, right? But we have these moments throughout the letter of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, which are just two letters that, of the four that, the New Testament scholars are fairly certain Paul wrote. So out of the four, two of them remain in our Bible. But when Paul talks about his experience in Corinth, this is the kind of stuff he says. 1 Corinthians 9, I'm just excerpting a little bit here. He says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them." Jumping to verse 22, "To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share blessings with them. I might share with them in its blessings." Okay. What is Paul telling us? This is he's not using churchy language. he's not being metaphorical here. He's being literal. He adopts a trade again, even though he's the leading theologian of this emergent Christian movement. He goes back to working with his hands for the sake of the gospel. This is a strategic choice on his part. He looks at the arrogance, the obsession with celebrity. He looks at he looks at the Corinthian culture and he says, what they want is a talking head. What they want is a smarty pants who can make them look good and can raise their sense of esteem, or their sense of culture and refinement or whatever. I'm going to do the exact opposite. I'm going to be the smartest day laborer. I'm going to be the public intellectual who's a day laborer, right? Paul tells us in his letters to the Corinthians, right? "I determined to know one thing among you, Christ and him crucified." Now we have to put this in context. Paul has just come from Athens, where he has demonstrated his book learning and his know-how and his ability to be conversant with any Greco-Roman philosophy. He's made it to the Areopagus, the Mars Hill, and spoken with the city elders, quoted their poets and philosophers back to them. He's just done exactly what the Corinthians want him to do. And instead of giving them what they want, he humbles himself. He humbles himself to becoming a day laborer again, preaching on the weekends, trying to win some through weakness, through humility, right? So New Testament scholars have been fascinated by this choice of Paul. He could win friends and influence people like gangbusters if he had just done in Corinth what he did in Athens, but he chooses a particular posture toward the culture for the sake of the gospel. And New Testament scholars are so curious about this. Why would Paul do this? So I return to our friend Doug Campbell, who's been trying to chart and keep track of all of Paul's crazy moves. And when he gets to Corinth, Campbell, and he's reflecting on Paul's experience in Corinth, he's like, it's not rocket science. This is a quote from page 95. "So many problems in Corinth, and I suspect in many other places, are solved if Christians are kinder to one another." It's out of love that Paul adopts this posture. It's out of love that Paul goes back to work. It's out of love that Paul stays in Corinth, a place he does not want to be. Worst of all, Corinth makes Philippi and Athens look like a dream. So many problems in Corinth. And that's what Doug Campbell notes. He says, in a larger, more diverse church like Corinth, Paul's ethic of kindness faced much tougher challenges. It had to overcome deep divisions of race, class, gender present within the fabric of the community. All the problems of the city are coming to church on Sunday. And Paul's having to meet them head on. And how does he decide to meet them? He decides to meet them in this humble, self-sacrificial posture. And that's why when we get to chapter 13, the wedding chapter, the great love chapter of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, he can say things like, so now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love, right? Paul can say those things about love in 1 Corinthians 13 because he's lived a self-sacrificial life among that culture. And it was hard work. And what happened? Well, we can summarize it like this. Paul is being formed. Paul is being changed. He's being transformed in the process. So he has to stay. God commands him to stay. He stays, despite very hostile conditions on the ground. Like, the Lord tells him, don't be afraid. Why does the Lord have to say that? Because Paul was literally afraid. Because he knew that his message and his means of delivering it was not going to be accepted. He feared for his life at points. And, something worse than just death, he might get stuck there. And that's exactly what God did. So, secondly, Paul has to adopt an appropriately countercultural lifestyle and go back to work. As I've indicated, he's had to do the opposite of what they wanted and expected. And if you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you find Paul having to continue to try and make plain to these Corinthians why he did what he did when he was with them. Why he didn't demand a great salary and benefits package as their talking head public intellectual. He has to tell them in 2 Corinthians over and over again why that's the case. But I think what's happening to Paul, and we can hear that in the things he shares with us about becoming all things to all people, and I learned that the greatest of these is love. What's happening to Paul is he's finding a new depth to his own apostolic calling. He's finding a closer and closer identification with Christ and his self-sacrificial means of love. Paul is changing. There are things that Paul didn't have that he wouldn't have been formed with if he hadn't gone to Corinth. Okay? So, in reflecting on, all right, we're doing good on time. Okay, I'm just trying to keep us on. But I find this so fascinating. I find it endlessly fascinating. So, Paul is stuck inside of Corinth with the Macedonia blues again. And he's learning so much about love, and he's having to empathize with these people. He's having to let the problems of Corinth be his problems, at least for a little while. And these are not the problems that he wants. These are not the problems that his grandmother would be happy that he was identifying with, right? This Hebrew of Hebrews is very out of place, right? But in the process, he's learning to love. He's developing new levels of empathy, right? He's getting humbled. He's having to look at these people in compassion. So many things are being formed in Paul. So I want to think about the place of empathy when it comes to the arts, and in particular modern and contemporary art. And that might be a strange choice, but it is consistent with the last, couple Sundays I've been here. So let's just keep trying it and see what happens. So I point to this painting of Picasso. It was mentioned last week by one of our participants. And there is a legacy within even modernism of trying to carve out space to create forms, to create a context for renewed empathy. So this is Picasso's dramatic, immense painting of the village of Guernica, Spain, that was bombed by Franco's government. And it's using many of Picasso's familiar tropes. We have a minotaur, we have people in distress, all this. I mean, it's one of Picasso's most famous works, right? He's trying to cast the plight of this tiny little Spanish village in large apocalyptic terms, right? So that the rest of the world will look and see what is happening in the Spanish Civil War. So that's one example, Pablo Picasso's Guernica. I'll give you another very unlikely example. This is from a more recent artist. This is Kiki Smith, who is was raised Catholic, but very influenced by feminism. And this is her depiction of two female saints. On the left, you have the Virgin Mary, and on the right, you have Mary Magdalene. Now, I don't need to tell you that these depictions of female saints very different than how they've been represented in the tradition. So let's start with, let's just go for the tough one first, all right? So the Virgin Mary. So she's in her Ornans posture here. She's in this receptive kind of prayer posture. But when we look at the surface of the sculpture, we see an eviscerated, skinless, here cast in bronze, she looks like a burn victim, right? She looks like she has been, her body's been desecrated, right? And yet, she's holding this submissive posture. What I love about Kiki Smith is she's bringing together these extreme views. She's bringing together these polar opposites here. How can it be that we, try to visually account for all that Mary experienced? It's usually internalized in the tradition, Mary's heart, the affliction of her heart, but her body was the vessel for the incarnation, right? So how do we do justice to her bodily experience, but at the same time, bear witness to her willingness to say yes to the Lord, right? We have then this visual contrast or this visual dichotomy that Kiki Smith gives us. It's arresting. It's arresting, right? It's a little shocking, but I want to say not blasphemous, not meant to destroy faith, meant to enrich it by adding a new layer of honesty. Okay, that's a tough one. I'll talk briefly about her Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, as you probably know in the tradition, much maligned as having this very bad background and this background of ill repute. I'm not going to get into the textual stuff there, but she becomes this icon of the repentant, penitent woman, right, with this terrible past, right? And in that way, she becomes kind of a vehicle for all the shame and guilt that many throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern period have associated with their own discipleship. Here, she's not represented in that deformed, decrepit, punished in her body kind of pose. Here again, we have another dichotomy in Kiki Smith's sculpture. We have a woman who, yes, has been freed. You see the broken chain around her leg, but instead of her body being the venue in which she is punished for her former sins, now she's been released. And it's hard to kind of see there in the bronze. We can tell that she doesn't have clothing on, but she's developed this sort of furry coat, okay? So what Kiki Smith is doing here is kind of taking this Northern European mythology of the wild women of the woods and sort of using that as a vehicle for, how does Mary Magdalene get her body back in her life as a saint, as a disciple? How is she restored to her own body? This is what Kiki Smith is trying to do here, right? And we recognize, depicting the Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene, that's contested territory. So she makes these strong choices. All right, we got to keep moving. Sorry. Another place I could point you in terms of thinking about empathy in contemporary art would be the often very controversial photographer Andreas Serrano, who himself has a Catholic background as well. These are not his most controversial photographs, but he has made some. We're not going to talk about them this morning, but here he did a series called Nomads, in which he found subjects, according to him, we don't really know, But according to him, he found subjects, people living in the condition of homelessness on the street, brings them into the studio and does these grand portraits of them, right? Trying to see them as people with their own innate dignity, right? At the same time, not, hard to look at too, okay? So that's another example of artists struggling to find ways to give voice to empathy. I'll give you one more example. This is the Colombian artist Doris Salcedo. This is a work called Untitled, and what you can see here is about 1,500 chairs stacked together. So I'm kind of zoomed in to give you a little bit of context, right? So this is an accumulation of just kitchen table chairs put together. I'll zoom out for a little more context. So this is this version of it was installed in Istanbul, Turkey. And you can see there's a building on one side and a building on the other, and there's a missing building that has been filled with this amalgam, this compressed. What Doris Salcedo often does is she finds everyday objects like a kitchen table chair that would have had a relationship to a body in someone's home and uses them in spaces like this out in the public to remind folks that those bodies that would have been in relationship with those objects are no longer here. So in her native Colombia, she's thinking about times in which people have been disappeared for their political dissonance or historic forms of violence in times of war. Okay, so it's very arresting vision. This was, her work was actually featured in Chicago a few years ago. And I should say, I'm trying to focus on artists that you would be able to experience in Chicago. So Kerry James Marshall is a Chicago-based artist, and his work is in the Art Institute. So that was who I talked about on the first Sunday. Last Sunday, Robert Gober, his work is on view at the Art Institute currently, right now. Like we could go and see it together. So I want to introduce you to one more artist who I think has taken this challenge of empathy and taken it up a notch. So this is an artist named Felix Gonzalez Torres. He is no longer with us, but should be. But Felix Gonzalez Torres is a conceptual artist. I'm really interested in conceptualism. And his work is on display at the Art Institute currently as well. So if you wanted to see it, you could go see it. But just give you a little bit of the flavor of his own reflection. This is when Felix thinks about his artistic practice, he's thinking in the same way that kind of Paul is thinking about, I've got to identify with these Corinthians. Even these Corinthians, I've got to identify with them if I'm going to be faithful to what God's put me here to do. Felix thinks about this identification as a vehicle for empathy too. He says, I'm a person who lives in this society, and I'm a product of this society and this culture. I am not only a reflection, I am that culture itself, right? As an artist, he can't adopt this sort of distanced, removed perspective on his work and the context it's meant for. He has to identify with the context. So his work is a profound body of work that's very recognizable. So I just want to see, what do you perceive in this image on the screen? This is one of his quote-unquote sculptures. What does it look like to you? I'm so curious. What?
Candy.
Yes, candy. Can everybody see that? It's actually this work that's on display right now at the Art Institute of Chicago in the modern wing. So if it looks like a big pile of individually wrapped candies, it is. I've got one of them right here. And this is a familiar form for Felix. So you can often see it in piles. there's a range of them that he's made in piles like against the wall, or sometimes laid out. This was at the Renaissance Society on the campus of UChicago. Laid out in this nice minimalist kind of rectangle here, this perfect blue rectangle, all right? His work, often referred to as manifestable, right? So he gives us the instructions for realizing one of his pieces. So he did not make these candies, he did not wrap these candies, he himself did not pile these candies or arrange them. He created ideas. I said he was a conceptual artist, that then the folks in the museum or in the gallery, they have to actually install. So that can be big piles of candy, or that can be, this is kind of hard to see in the light here, but that can be strands of lights. That can be, this is even harder to see, but that can be just these timelines. This was on display at the Art Institute up until a couple months ago. But there's what you can see here at the top of the wall, just below the ceiling, is this painted timeline. Particular details like Red Canoe 1987 or Paris 1985. These are his portraits. When someone would sit for a portrait, he would interview them, get them to tell them their story, and this is what he would paint. He would stencil these details, this like obscure timeline, sometimes with like big events, like big cultural events, and sometimes very personal, private, intimate events. Anyways, he also has stacks of paper. So the piles of candy you can interact with. Everybody can take a piece of candy, and the stacks of paper, everyone can take a piece of paper. He is, in a sense, giving away his work, right? But we're not, I'm not a collector of his work. I just got a piece of candy, right? I can't try and sell that on eBay. So he's interested in like making his work very accessible, like very available to the public. I'm just going to get some of his quotes out here so you have a sense of his. He wanted minimal means for maximal meaning. He wanted to use simple everyday things, right? It's just a piece of candy, right? In a pile on the floor of a gallery, right? It's just a billboard in a city, right? It could be easily missed, right? He just takes these sort of everyday objects, and I'll talk about this one very briefly to give a good example. So this is a stack of printed posters. All of his work is, and this is what it looks like. I'll just show it to you. It was on display in Chicago up early part of this year, but this is what it looks like. I can leave it out if you want to look at it. When I can, I try and bring some proof that I'm not making all this stuff up. Okay, I realize that's probably helpful. So this is a work called all of his pieces are untitled, and sometimes they'll have this nice little parenthetical reference. So untitled parentheses, death by gun. So this is a heavy topic that he's engaging with here. But I want to kind of set it in context for you. So it's a poster. It's a stack of posters. It's about 9 inches off the ground, and Felix did not take these pictures himself. He just actually took them out of the world and made them art. This was in 1989. This was a cover story, I think, for Time magazine. So Time magazine ran a photo essay of everyone in the United States who had died by gun, either self-inflicted or homicide or accidental. Everyone who had been killed by a gun for 1 week in 1989. Their picture, if they could find their picture, they printed their picture, but some detail, you can see on the poster, some detail about their life. If their picture was available, they used it. Felix took that out of Time magazine and made this poster. Now, he doesn't get credit for the journalism of it, but what is he doing in turning it into an art piece? Turning all that information, We're talking about 400 or so lives lost to gun violence of some kind in the United States in the month of May 1989. You and I mean, we're not built to, I'm not a statistician, I'm not an accountant, and I think they would even struggle too, to actually compute the numbers given to us in these kinds of statistics. To put the number 400 on the poster wouldn't have much of an effect, but to reprint all the faces and names of these individuals has a different effect. But what do we do when this happens in our country? And it keeps happening, again and again. This was made in 1990, but like I said, it was just displayed in Chicago this past year as a part of a show at the Museum of Contemporary Photography, all about gun violence. Anyways, what does it do? Well, I can tell you what it doesn't do first. Oftentimes, when these massacres or these great tragedies, mass shootings happen, a tree is planted or a park is opened, or maybe we spend a bunch of money and pay an artist to make a sculpture that we can go take a picture of or walk around, or just use as kind of civic furniture eventually, something that, downtown Chicago in the Loop, we have multiple of these, right? Most of the people passing by on the street can't tell you the artist or what the name of the piece is or what it's even there for, right? It just becomes kind of the furniture of our urban life, right? Felix is doing something very different. He puts this very big, very public concern into very private, very personal means, right? It's just a poster. You can see the piece in a museum and you can walk right past it. Like, what is that? Art being weird again, right? But if you know what Felix is up to, and if you read the sign on the wall of the gallery, you can take one. And what do you do when you take one? Well, you have to get down on your hands and knees and roll the thing up. Now, I was reminded the last time I saw this, well, what do we usually get down on our knees in front and see names and faces? It's when we're in the cemetery. So I'm making a choice to roll up this poster and take it with me. That's a personal choice. And then I got to live with this thing, right? What am I going to, do you hang that on your wall? You don't hang that on your wall, right? What Felix is doing is he's using the contemporary art world, a world where people are kind of familiar with the unexpected, right? They're kind of used to surprises. And he's saying, well, how do I take this really big, almost incomprehensible idea of the plague of gun violence in our country and kind of reduce it down to something that you can touch and hold, something you could hang on to, right? That's the effort here. When Felix talks about his work, he talks about how these works are kind of bringing two different worlds together. He says, these works are public and private, right? Very public issue, privately received. Between personal and social, between the fear of loss and the joy of loving, of growing, of changing, of always becoming more, of losing oneself slowly and then being replenished all over again from scratch. I need the viewer, I need the public to complete the work. I ask the public to help me, to take responsibility, to become part of my work, to join me. So the act of picking a piece of candy off a pile, a big pile of candy in a museum, seems so insignificant and so nonchalant. But if you know what Felix is up to and you have a better sense of the story and you pay attention to what's in the parentheses of the title, that this is actually a portrait of Ross. This pile of candy is a portrait of Ross. Okay, who is Ross? Ross is Felix's partner who died of AIDS the year before he did. So in a time in the 1980s and 1990s when many contemporary artists were finding the most aggressive, the most in-your-face, the most rage-filled way to protest the AIDS crisis as it was unfolding, you had someone in the person of Felix creating piles of candy, trying to use this little medium, this super ephemeral medium, to say, hey, my story matters. My story counts. Can you engage with my story, right? If this is a portrait of Ross, that means that whenever I take a piece of candy, and whenever my kids, or like whoever's with me at the time, my students, when they're taking a piece of candy, that pile is being diminished. And if I know that, and read the sign, that pile is the approximate body weight of Ross, right? He doesn't look like a pile of candy, but the weight of this pile is approximately his body weight. When I realize that the AIDS virus attacks the immune system and the person wastes away, I am like participating, rehearsing, reviewing Felix's own story. But I get to walk away with a piece of candy in my mouth, right? We don't often have categories for this, right? It's subversive, but in the best way, right? Felix is creating these piles of candy. There's like one, there's some really beautiful ones, right? And he tells us, the work is not complete unless somebody interacts with it. I could talk about this work for hours, actually, because it's doing so many cool things in the museum. The museum is the place where they hold all the precious, priceless artifacts. And now it's also the place where they have piles of candy. So when you go around with your grandkids and they're like, candy, the security guard, who is normally faceless and nameless, who actually spends a lot more time with the art than we do, has to step in and say, no, it's okay, right? There's power structures, economic structures being overturned. It's beautiful on so many different levels, but it's a way for us to find new forms of empathy, is what I want to say. And that's why I appreciate Felix so much. Paul's question in, let's just say Corinth. Paul's question in Corinth, I'll look at that, was love, fidelity, loyalty, allegiance, all those wacky things. The Corinthians were chasing after all kinds of stuff. And Paul says, can we use, are we going to use love any way that we want, or can the love of Christ actually transform us? That's Paul's question, and I think that's our question for today. How can we show that Christ's love is truly better? How can we show that it's truly better, right? I'm grateful for imaginative opportunities like Felix's pile of candy to think about that, to think about reaching people in new ways. Anyway, okay. Again, somehow I filled up the time, and we've got 5 minutes until the service. Thank you guys so much for being such willing participants for this wild ride. I mean, who knew, right? Who knew? But it's been a lot of fun, and I appreciate your attention. I'm here for questions, but at the same time, I know if you got to get to service, feel free to scoot on out. So thank you again for this time. I really, thank you. Oh, thanks.
And I will ever think of movie contemporary art to see, which
Oh.
I have ignored mostly.
I know, it's weird. It's well,
Way down to
yeah.
It's awesome.
They're not doing themselves any favors. I mean, there's a lot of storytelling that has to happen, and